It's fine. So, one of the weird things about the Marvel Cinematic Universe is that even though it's a ginormous billion-dollar asset of the Walt Disney Corporation, everything it does keeps demanding to be described as the studio taking some kind of unprecedented risk. But when you get down to it, the real risky challenge for Marvel on this much-hyped team-up with Spider-Man rights holder Sony is that it marks the first time since pretty much the whole thing started a decade ago that part of the so-called Cinematic Universe has had to operate in someone else's shadow. You see, for the most part, the Marvel Cinematic Universe superheroes were characters who'd never been put to film before, or where they had, it wasn't particularly successful. But while yes, it was always a safe bet that Homecoming would be better than the two Amazing Spider-Man movies because everything is better than the two Amazing Spider-Man movies, the fact is every subsequent Spider-Man movie is probably still going to struggle with the looming shadow of the first two Sam Raimi films, a pair of the best examples of blockbuster filmmaking as art in the entire canon. In the exact same way that, fairly or not, every cinematic Superman has the impossible task of trying to measure up to Richard Donner and Christopher Reeve. And it's that inescapable fact that probably goes a long way, though importantly not all the way, toward parsing out why, despite being by default the best Spider-Man movie since Spider-Man 2, Spider-Man Homecoming ends up as probably the least consequential, most disposable feeling MCU installment since Thor: The Dark World. Now that's not to say that it's of comparable quality to Thor 2 or that it's specifically a bad film by any estimation, but for all the build-up and bluster leading up to its release, it's ultimately a small, shallow, pretty forgettable film. And while there's nothing that says that this or any superhero movie has to be more than a quick, visually arresting distraction without much in the way of substance or emotional investment, it feels like Homecoming was supposed to have substance, but ultimately just doesn't. It's fine, but there's just not much to it. Our storyline picks up a few months after Captain America: Civil War, with Peter Parker now having a difficult time readjusting himself to teenage life since he's now overly preoccupied with when he'll be going on his next big boy superhero mission and pestering Tony Stark about how he might become a full-fledged member of the Avengers. This ends up causing him trouble within his already difficult high school social life, but also leads him to take stupid, dangerous risks in his superhero outings that might end up putting an end to his career just as it's taking off. So it's basically a stay-in-school kids movie with the Avengers standing in for taking an early NBA contract or whatever. Now that's a pretty good angle, and it comes with a pretty decent bad guy in the form of Michael Keaton as the Vulture, here reimagined as the leader of a crew of demolition workers who lost out on the lucrative cleaning up New York after the Avengers contract and instead became a gang of super weapon scavenging arms dealers. There's actually like 3 other bad guys in there too, but you might as well be surprised. Keaton is really good here, incidentally. It's probably the first time that an "oh, the poor forgotten working class Joe" subplot hasn't made me want to roll my eyes out of my fucking head since the election, so there's that. What's clear from the outset is that the mandate here was to differentiate this from the rest of the oversaturated superhero genre by making a high school comedy where the guy just happens to also be Spider-Man. And that's probably the right approach, or at least the most interesting one available. The action in the film is all perfunctory and forgettable outside of a comedy scene highlighting that Spider-Man's powers are kind of useless outside the specific environment of downtown Manhattan, and a scene where he's testing out the functions of his new suit that's not really an action scene at all, but is such a winning character sequence, it kind of made me forget how much I really dislike the idea of Spider-Man having a high-tech costume. I also really like how, after all the Sturm und Drang and loudmouth asshole pontificating on the internet about recasting most of the supporting cast for greater diversity, the actual film treats it as kind of matter-of-fact and unremarkable. Peter Parker is seemingly the only white kid in his circle of friends. Most of the other scenes in school or general public look the same way. His main crush is black, his best friend is Asian, and none of it ever once meaningfully is remarked upon, even in at least one instance where it could have been conceivably factored into a big plot twist. The issue, though, is that while the high school focus works in narrative terms, it just never feels as involving as it's supposed to. And look, it's very possible that I'm just finally too far removed from the teenage experience to buy into high school crushes and detention and lunchroom cliques and who's taking who to the big dance as these earth-shakingly important plot details, but if the movie can't get an audience to care anyway, isn't that the movie's problem? I mean, I was invested in the drama in Edge of 17, and that didn't have Michael Keaton trying to kill people with a mechanical bird suit. Within that same token, yeah, I'm glad we didn't feel the need to go back and rehash the Uncle Ben business, but it's eventually apparent that the filmmakers never found anything of equal dramatic weight to replace that angle as the film's emotional foundation. There's a bit towards the end where they pull out one of those classic Spidey must lift the heavy thing to escape tableaus, and I found myself realizing just how little feel I actually cared. The film doesn't seem to realize that the lifting heavy stuff thing only works as a big moment in superhero movies when the act is framed as a metaphor for all the emotional and psychological weight the hero is also burdened by. And we never get a sense that's what's going on with Peter. He's just a kid who wants a job. I feel like this is coming off overly negative. There is a lot to recommend, even in a modestly uninvolving film. Most of it is centered on the cast. Tom Holland remains terrific casting. Robert Downey Jr. actually shows up to work here. This is not a phoned-in cameo. I really like Tony Revolori as the reimagined Flash Thompson. Jacob Batalon as the Riot as Ned. I have no idea where I'm supposed to know Lara Harrier from, but she's a born movie star as Liz Allen. Marissa Tomei is a lot of fun as Aunt May, even though her role in the story consists almost entirely of other characters remarking on how hot she is, which is weird because they don't know that Aunt May is usually an old lady. And while I get the sense I'm really gonna get sick of nerd culture parsing out who it is and or isn't that Zendaya actually ended up playing over the next few months, her performance, perfectly fine. Spider-Man Homecoming is a disappointment, but it's not too much of one. It's not a bad film, but we expect more out of Marvel at this point, and despite the recent unpleasantness, I still expect more out of a Spider-Man movie. It sets up a lot of potential with the franchise to improve, it portends interesting things for the next big crossover, and it has a really, really great final shot, but the whole thing feels like it was hashed out in a hurry and could have used some time to coalesce into something greater than the sum of its parts. 2.5 stars, recommended with reservations. Don't shoot the messenger.